Right. Okay. Hopefully it works this time. Otherwise, I'll switch over into Randika's computer and we'll continue there. So yes, we have a lot of languages in Sri Lanka, and they're all very well integrated. Just a quick word: Ketale is a loan word into Sinhala from English, like many other words, and it's now part of Sinhala. So I think let's move on to the next slide, Randika. Yes. Creole English. So Randika, would you like to say anything about that before I go into it? No? So this makes a nice segue. The subject of the Ketale makes a nice segue into another thing I wanted to talk about, which is a sign of our mixing and integration and multiculturalism in Sri Lanka. It is Creole English. So it's a type of English we speak in Sri Lanka, which some of you might actually speak. But that's a unique language in Sri Lanka. Now, it's incomprehensible to standard English speakers, but we Lankans understand it. And I'll give you a few examples so you know what I mean. It's basically the combination. So a Creole language is when two languages meet. When two languages meet, let's say Sinhala and English, you get what's called a pidgin language, a combination of both languages. A Creole is when the next generation learns that as their mother tongue. All right. So let's say in Sri Lankan English Creole case, it was a combination of the various languages of Sri Lanka with English vocabulary, which gave rise to a type of English we speak only in Sri Lanka. If any of you are familiar with Jamaican English, or maybe in Singapore or Malaysia, Manglish, it's basically our version of that. So I'm very passionate about this because I didn't even realize it was a type of English until I began interacting with people who didn't speak it. And then I realized, oh my gosh, this is fascinating. So now, just to give you an idea of what that is, what it's like, Radhika, can you go to the next slide? Right. Here's some examples. So you will all notice, I'm going to now switch into speaking in this Creole English, right? So anyone who understands can feel free to giggle or, raise your hand if you understand. But here's a good example. When we used to come back home from abroad, someone would inevitably say, here, you all have come down recently, no? And obviously that means that's gibberish in standard English. But in Lankan English, we know that means they are acknowledging that you visited from abroad. Or they would say, at a funeral, you'd often hear people say, Ane sinno men, in vain he has passed. Something along those lines, right? But again, it makes no sense in English, standard English. But when someone says Ane sinno, that refers to the fact that something tragic has happened, something sad has happened. In vain he has passed means, it's tragic that this person has passed away, maybe passed young or something like that. Another one is what for the telling. So when you talk to people, they might say, what for the telling, in order to emphasize something, right? And I was talking the other day to my father, and he explained a really interesting one to me. He was talking about referring to somebody who was someone who was regarded as an alcoholic in the community, and he said, "Aye, that fellow, yeah, why? From those days, he was an ace boozer, And then you think, what is an ace boozer? And then he explained it to me, and then I realized, okay, an ace boozer is a person who drinks a lot. So there's many examples of this way of talking. We invert the grammar, we change it around, but we use English vocabulary and combine it with Sinhala grammar, and we've got this unique Creole English. Other examples are things like, people will say, that's gone for 6 to mean something negative has happened. That's finished, gone for 6. And the tone as well makes a difference. The tone tells you what is happening. So if someone was stuck in really thick traffic, they would say, my God, chock-a-block with traffic today, huh? But, if it was light traffic, they might say, traffic was there today, but... am I here? Yeah, I'm here. Okay. And then other things are many happy returns of the day as a way of greeting someone on their birthday. Very rare. I only know Sri Lankans who say this. And of course, putting a drink, putting a chat, putting the light, these sorts of terms which make no sense in English, but in this Creole English we understand. So often you find this spoken in Eurasian families, but there's lots of other communities who speak this as well. So that's another example of how mixing and how we've not just taken things but integrated it into our own way of functioning. Next slide, Bandika. Do you want to do Baila? Okay. So again, Baila is another example of multiculturalism in Sri Lanka, right? So Baila was created in a context where we had an influence of various cultures combining together. Portuguese Ceylon was possibly the only place in the world where we had the influence of Portuguese people from Portugal, but also African rhythms and percussions from the Afro-Sri Lankan community. There were Malay Rabana drums. A lot of Sri Lankan traditional drums are of Malay origin. Then we had the Sinhala language and the Tamil and English languages, English later, but Sinhala and Tamil. And all of that combined together with whatever quality we had in Sri Lanka that allowed us to be creative to create Baila. Now, Baila means to dance in Portuguese. Even the iconic Baila dance that you might have seen of people sort of like twisting around goes back to an old Portuguese wedding dance. It's absolutely fascinating, and again, a unique example of cultural mixing and integration. Next slide, Randika. Are you doing fashion, or you want me to do fashion as well? Okay, fashion. So fashion is another. So now we've talked about language, music, and ethnic groups. Let's talk about fashion. Fashion is really interesting because we often think of fashion as something that is almost standardized, but it really isn't. In Sri Lanka, we have a diverse array of fashions that originate in an ethnic community that came usually from another place. The sarongs are the best example I can think of. So sarongs come from Indonesia and Malaysia, that part of the world, where they call it sarung, right? Sarung became the singular word sarong, or the English singular word sarong. And it's basically, over there, it's a tube of fabric that goes around the body, and you can tie it in different ways as well, just like we do. We even have fez hats, those red hats that you might see in old pictures of Moorish Sri Lankans, right? That's a very Ottoman Turkic thing. It goes back to the Middle East. And then batik. Batik is absolutely fascinating because batik is actually a very Indonesian art, but specifically a Javan art. So if you go to Indonesia, you get hundreds of varieties of batik. And we have a subset of that here in Sri Lanka. Batik, as you know, is this particular type of dyeing. And it's actually coincidentally very common and very popular down in the south of Sri Lanka, where some of the biggest Malay communities live. So I really think many Sri Lankans don't value diversity of fashion. We often don't look at someone in traditional clothes, the Malay baju kurung or the sarama, and think, oh, this is an expression of our culture. If anything, we sort of, I think, as a general rule, many Sri Lankans think it's a bit odd to wear that stuff. But these are all examples of our cultural integration. Even this frock that you often see many Sri Lankan women wearing, that goes back to a Portuguese style of fashion. And of course, wedding attire, bridal gowns, and so on are part of Sri Lankan fashion as well. And finally, even the amude is a part of Sri Lankan fashion used by our indigenous people. It's a really handy thing when you're wandering around in the forest. Okay, naming conventions. Another thing that's very diverse about Sri Lanka is our naming conventions. So we are one of the few places in the world where we have such a diversity of naming conventions that it's really difficult to identify where a person comes from just based on their name. In Australia, as an example, we have a lot of Anglo-Australian names or Irish Australian names, which are often easily identifiable. But in Sri Lanka, we have a huge amount of naming conventions, but we then also mix them up. another sign of our multiculturalism, right? So we're all familiar with Portuguese names like Pereira, Silva, Don, and Sinho, right? You know, Silva means the forest, so the Silva means from the forest. Pereira, my own surname, is it means pear tree, pear tree, right? Then there's Dutch names, Van Dort, and so on. And of course, you have Sinhala and Tamil names. But don't forget, we also have Adivasi names. So the indigenous naming conventions are very unique. There's no surname. It's just your community and your name. So Sudubandilata would be Sudubandilata. Maybe Uruvarige Sudubandilata at most. You know, the other thing about naming conventions, just very quickly, is Sri Lanka is one of the few places in the world, and I'm using my own example here, where you can have a person who has a French first name, a Hindu middle name, a Portuguese surname, and speaking a language that comes from Sanskrit, and has a family that has Buddhists, Catholics, and Muslims in it. Right? And this is very normal for us Sri Lankans, but that is very unique. So my first name, Jerome, is French. My surname is Pereira. And I have all this diversity encapsulated within my name and my family. And that's a very normal thing. Many of us, if we dig into our family history, will find the same sort of diversity. And this is very unique. It's not something you find anywhere in many other places in the world. Moving on to cultural practices. So another sign of our cultural integration in Sri Lanka is our cultural practices. A good example for me has always been Aurudu, right? Most of us love Aurudu. We love that celebration, and we love the celebratory nature of Aurudu. But Aurudu in its components are actually an example of multiculturalism in Sri Lanka. The Rabana, with the Raban Pada that they play in Aurudu, is from Malaysia and Indonesia, from the Malay archipelago. We wear sarongs in Aurudu. The food, all the food on the Aurudu table comes from somewhere else. So the cookies comes from the Netherlands. We have dodol from Indonesia and that region of the world. From South India, we have kaung, mung kaung, and things like that. And yet we celebrate this as a Sri Lankan tradition. So Aurudu is a really good example of a Creole culture. Kite flying, which I've seen a lot of in Gaul, in how can I say, Gaul face when I was young. Even the way we drink tea, right? We drink tea with milk and biscuits, which is a very English style of tea drinking. Many places in the world don't drink tea that way. Then we have celebrations like Eid and Thai Pongal, and of course Christmas. Christmas is a huge occasion. When I traveled to Negombo, because Randika comes from Negombo, they celebrate Christmas so intensely over there. I thought Colombo Christmases were intense until I went to Negombo. But Christmas time brings a whole lot of traditions and Christmas cakes, coconut wine and a few different wines, milk wine in some burger communities. Bruder, they make these special bundt cakes in some families. And usually there's a person assigned in the family to make it. These are all traditions we've gotten from other places, which are now Sri Lankan traditions. And finally, Adam's Peak, right? We all know that Adam's Peak is a point of religious congregation for Muslims, Hindus, the Catholic population of Sri Lanka, and so on. So again, it's not just that these communities and their cultures exist, but they integrate in a way that we can all appreciate. Even the white string, the Pirit Nula, is an old Hindu tradition that goes all the way back to ancient India.